never imagined that a single piece of paper could make my knees shake, my palms sweat, and my heart pound so hard I thought it might split my chest open. But that is exactly what happened the morning I opened the envelope from the bank and saw the number staring back at me in bold black print. $53,000 charged on my credit card. Not 53, not 500, but 53,000 in one single day, and I felt the air leave my lungs as if someone had shoved me into deep water without warning. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't fraud by some stranger halfway across the world. It was something far worse, because the handwriting scrawled across the receipts was one I knew too well. The same looping L's and sharp T's that had signed the birthday card she once handed me with a forced smile, my mother-in-law. In that instant, the world tilted, because betrayal doesn't come from the hands of enemies. It comes from those who sit at your table and eat the meals you cook. It comes from family. And before I dive deeper into this story, I want to pause and say something personal. If you're here listening, if you've ever had your trust broken in ways you can't explain to outsiders without your throat tightening, then please know your presence matters more than you think. When you leave a comment or press that like button, you aren't just clicking a screen, you are telling me and countless others that we're not alone, that stories like this deserve to be heard, and I can promise you it gives me strength to keep sharing the hottest chapters of my life. My name is Claire. I am 32 years old, and I thought I had my life under control. I believed I had built a safe little world with my husband, a home that was supposed to be full of comfort and stability, a place where love meant protection and family meant loyalty. I worked hard. I saved every extra dollar I could. I cooked dinners with care. I kept the bills paid and the house clean, and I told myself this was what grown-up life was supposed to feel like. But behind the curtain, hidden just beneath the surface, there were cracks I tried not to see, cracks that widened a little more each time my mother-in-law visited with her smug eyes and her barbed compliments that were meant to sting just enough to remind me I didn't really belong. It began long before that, Bill. Looking back now, I can trace the shadow to smaller moments that should have been red flags, but that I brushed aside in the name of keeping peace. A bracelet that vanished from my dresser and reappeared weeks later in her jewelry box, explained away as, "Oh, I must have thought it was mine, dear. You know how things get mixed up." A gift card my parents had sent for Christmas that disappeared from the kitchen drawer and was later used at her favorite department store, which she dismissed as coincidence. Even the way she reached into my closet one afternoon while we were getting ready for dinner and pulled out a silk scarf I had saved for months to buy, draping it around her shoulders with a laugh and a careless, "You don't mind if I borrow this, do you?" She never returned it. At the time I told myself they were small things, not worth starting a war over, not worth breaking the fragile truce between us. After all, I wanted my marriage to work, and my husband had grown up treating her whims like law. He would shrug whenever I mentioned it, saying I was imagining things, or that I must have misplaced the gift card, or that maybe the bracelet had fallen behind the dresser. So I swallowed my anger and tried to convince myself I was being dramatic. But deep down, I knew the truth. She wasn't careless, she was deliberate, and she enjoyed every second of watching me doubt my own sanity. Still, nothing could have prepared me for the day I opened that envelope and saw how far she was willing to go. Page after page of transactions, luxury boutiques, designer handbags, diamond jewelry, 5-star restaurants, champagne tastings, high-end salons. She had lived a fantasy day straight out of a glossy magazine, and she had funded it entirely with my credit card, as if my life savings were nothing but a piggy bank for her greed. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the papers, and I remember leaning against the kitchen counter, staring at the list until the words blurred together, wondering how it was possible that someone who claimed to love her son could so casually destroy his wife. The cruelest part was the handwriting, because attached to those statements were copies of the signed receipts, and I recognized the flourish of her pen the way you recognize the face of someone who has sneered at you for years. She hadn't even tried to hide it. No disguise, no attempt to forge another name. just her bold signature sprawled across purchase after purchase, as if daring me to confront her, daring me to speak up and risk being dismissed again. That arrogance cut deeper than the debt itself, because it told me she believed I was powerless, that I would keep quiet the way I always had, that I would carry the shame while she paraded her new diamonds in front of her friends. I slid down to the kitchen floor, my back pressed against the cabinet, the papers trembling in my hands, and for a long time I couldn't breathe. I thought of the years I had worked overtime shifts, the nights I had skipped dinners out to save money, the sacrifices I had made so my husband and I could have a future without constant stress. All of it wiped out in 24 hours by a woman who had never respected me. A woman who smiled at me across the dinner table while plotting how to gut me financially. I felt small, invisible, and humiliated, like a child who has been caught playing at adulthood only to be laughed at by someone older, meaner, and more ruthless. But even in that pit of despair, a small flame began to spark. Because as I stared at those signatures, I realized something important. Arrogance leaves evidence, and evidence, if used wisely, can be turned into a weapon. Betrayal never arrives like a storm crashing down all at once. It arrives like a dripping faucet, small drops that seem harmless until the ceiling caves in, and that is exactly how my mother-in-law worked her way into my life. At first, she cloaked her intrusions in charm, sweeping into my home with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged more than I did, offering little smiles that felt more like smirks, touching my things as though they were community property rather than mine. I remember the first jolt of discomfort when she appeared at dinner wearing my silk scarf, the one I had saved for months to afford, the one I had wrapped around my neck with pride just weeks before, and she looked me straight in the eye with a laugh that said she enjoyed the shock on my face. When I timidly asked, she gave her airy excuse that she must have thought it was hers, and without a trace of shame she left that night, with the scarf still draped across her shoulders, never to return it. And I swallowed my protest because I told myself marriage was compromise, and peace was worth more than fabric, even though inside it felt like my dignity had been quietly stripped away. The pattern spread like cracks in glass, impossible to ignore but easy for others to dismiss, especially my husband, who seemed to have been trained his whole life to excuse her behavior. A necklace vanished from my dresser, a delicate chain my parents had given me as a graduation gift, and weeks later I saw her at a church gathering proudly displaying it as if it had been hers forever. Neighbors admiring her new jewelry, while I stood frozen, choking on words I knew would be turned against me if I dared speak them. A gift card from my parents disappeared from the kitchen drawer where I had tucked it away for a treat, and when I raised the issue, she tilted her head and suggested maybe I had misplaced it, her voice dripping with condescension, while I knew she had spent it at the very store she loved to brag about shopping at. Each time I tried to bring something up, my husband sighed, rolled his eyes, or told me I was imagining things, and slowly I began to question my own memory, retracing steps in my head late at night until I felt dizzy with doubt. The cruelest theft was not the objects themselves, but the certainty that I could trust my own mind, because she was stealing not just things, but my reality, and that kind of theft leaves scars deeper than empty drawers. The disrespect was not limited to what she took, but also how she spoke, her words slicing through me with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to wound. She would praise my cooking while slipping in the reminder that her lasagna recipe was legendary. She would smile sweetly while mocking my thriftiness in front of others, and she would laugh about how young wives always think they know best, while glancing at me as if to say I was nothing more than a child playing house. One spring afternoon, she even borrowed my wedding photograph, pretending she admired the frame and wanted to display it temporarily, only for me to later discover from a neighbor that she had hung it proudly in her own hallway and accepted compliments on it, as though it were her life and not mine captured in that picture. The message was clear. Nothing of mine was sacred, not my possessions, not my achievements, not even my memories. because she could twist them to fit her narrative and no one around her seemed willing to stop her. Each time I chose silence, convincing myself it was easier than being mocked, but that silence came with a cost, shrinking me piece by piece until I barely recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. Yet, even in the silence, I began to keep a secret record, not on paper, but in the quiet corners of my mind, a ledger of every theft and every insult, a tally written in invisible ink across my chest, so I would never lose track of the truth. The scarf, the necklace, the gift card, the photograph, the cutting remarks, the hollow laughter. Each moment was a mark I carried with me, proof that what I was experiencing was real, even if no one else believed it. By the time the envelope arrived with $53,000 charged to my account, that ledger had become unbearably heavy, and I understood with piercing clarity that these were not accidents or misunderstandings. They were deliberate choices, acts of arrogance from a woman who believed she could break me without consequence. She thought I would always stay silent, that I would always doubt myself, that I would always choose peace over confrontation. But what she never realized was that arrogance leaves evidence, and evidence can become the rope that hangs the guilty when the time is right. The scarf, the necklace, the photograph, they were only the beginning, because once she realized I would not openly fight her, she grew bolder, testing the limits of what she could take until my life began to feel like a stage where every scene was designed to humiliate me. Gift cards disappeared from drawers, cash vanished from my wallet, makeup I had barely used went missing from the bathroom cabinet, and each time I mentioned it, the same refrain returned like a broken record from both her and my husband. I must have misplaced it. I must be imagining things. I must be tired. The repetition began to chip away at me until there were nights I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at receipts and empty boxes, wondering if I truly was losing my grip on reality. There is a kind of cruelty that doesn't bruise your skin, but instead infects your mind, and she mastered it, planting seeds of doubt until I was watering them with my own fears. What made it worse was the way she paraded her triumphs as if she were daring me to object, wearing my missing necklace to a family barbecue, flashing a designer purse that looked suspiciously like the one I had hidden in my closet, arriving at gatherings with clothes so new the tags must have been cut minutes before. She would smile sweetly at me in front of others, then lean close and whisper little comments only I could hear, remarks about how clumsy I was with money, how careless I seemed to be with valuables, how maybe I wasn't ready to manage a household of my own. And every time she spoke like that, I saw my husband's blank expression, his refusal to take sides, and the silence that settled between us became heavier than any argument could have been. It is one thing to be stolen from by an enemy. It is another to be betrayed in front of someone who swore to protect you, and the second betrayal stings longer. By then, I had stopped mentioning the small thefts, because I already knew how the conversation would go, and I could not bear the cycle of accusation and dismissal anymore. Instead, I carried the weight in silence, wearing my doubt like an invisible cloak, shrinking into myself so much that even my closest friends noticed a difference, asking if I was tired, if I was overworked, if I was unhappy in my marriage. I lied and told them everything was fine, because how could I explain that I was being quietly erased in my own home, that my possessions, my memories, even my confidence were being stripped from me piece by piece? To admit it would make it too real, and so I buried it, but buried things do not disappear, they fester, and soon the resentment in my chest grew sharper than the fear of confrontation. I began to fantasize about screaming in her face, about grabbing my things back, about exposing her for what she was, but each time I imagined it, I saw the smirk she would wear as she dismissed me again, and I swallowed my rage like poison. Still, there was one thing I could not ignore, one moment that seared itself into my memory and refused to fade, the day she looked me in the eye and told me that I was lucky to have married her son, because without her guidance I would be nothing, The words slid out of her mouth like venom, and though she said them softly enough that no one else heard, they echoed inside me louder than any scream. In that instant, I realized what she had been doing all along. Not just stealing things, but stealing power, reshaping me into someone small enough to crush whenever she pleased. And though I stayed silent yet again, inside me something shifted, because humiliation can burn you hollow, but it can also forge steel in the ashes. The ledger in my mind grew heavier, and though I did not yet know it, I was inching closer to the day when all those stolen pieces would be the evidence that saved me. The envelope looked ordinary, just another piece of mail waiting on the kitchen counter, but the moment I tore it open, I felt the ground beneath me shift, because there in bold black numbers was a total that made my blood run cold: $53,000 charged in a single day on my credit card. A number so staggering, it almost didn't feel real. My hands began to shake as I flipped through the pages, each one filled with lines of charges that spelled out a life I didn't recognize: dinners at five-star restaurants, champagne tastings, designer boutiques, diamond jewelry, luxury salons, all neatly stacked into 24 hours of indulgence that could never have been mine. I felt like I had been pushed underwater, lungs burning, because this was no accident, no clerical error, no random fraud by a stranger. This was deliberate, and the cruelest part was that I already knew exactly whose hands had swiped that card without hesitation. I spread the statements across the kitchen table and forced myself to look at each receipt, and it was there, in the careless swoop of ink at the bottom, the looping L and sharp T, that I recognized instantly, because they were the same flourishes that had signed the birthday card she once gave me with that fake smile. The same handwriting that decorated Christmas tags, meant to look sweet, but always carried a sting. She had not even bothered to hide it. She had signed my name with her hand, leaving behind proof as though she believed I would never dare to use it against her. The arrogance cut deeper than the debt itself, because it told me she thought I was powerless, that I would sit silently while she paraded around in her new diamonds, that I would be the one drowning in shame while she enjoyed the spoils. And in that moment, humiliation burned hotter than anger, because not only had she stolen my money, she had stolen my voice by making me the one who would be blamed. When I showed the statement to my husband, desperate for him to finally see what I had been enduring, his face twisted into disbelief, but not at her, at me, and he muttered that maybe I had forgotten I shopped, maybe I had misused the card and was too embarrassed to admit it. Maybe I was overreacting again. The words struck harder than any physical blow because they confirmed the truth I had tried so hard not to accept. I was alone in this fight. The man who had vowed to protect me saw me as careless rather than victim, and in siding with his mother's innocence, he left me stranded on an island of debt and despair. I wanted to scream, to rip the statement to shreds, to throw the jewelry she now wore in her smug photos across the room, but instead I stood frozen, gripping the pages so tightly my knuckles turned white, because I understood that in their eyes my pain was invisible, and that invisibility was its own prison. That night, I sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by the scattered statements, unable to stop the tears as they blurred the ink into black rivers that smeared across my fingers. And I felt more broken than I had ever felt in my life. Years of saving, years of sacrifice, the overtime shifts, the careful budgeting, the meals skipped so that we could build a future, all erased in a single day by a woman who smiled at me across the dinner table as though she hadn't gutted my world. I thought of every small theft before this moment and realized they had all been rehearsals, steps leading her to believe she could take anything she wanted without consequence. And perhaps she was right, because until now I had let her. But even as I lay on the cold floor, crushed under the weight of betrayal, a tiny ember sparked inside me, because arrogance leaves footprints, and as much as she wanted me to believe I was powerless, she had made one mistake. She left her signature behind, and signatures can speak even when voices are silenced. The days after I opened that envelope unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake from, each morning starting with a new phone call. each evening ending with a stack of letters that piled higher on my kitchen table until it looked less like a home and more like an office of debt collectors. The bank was relentless, their tone polite but sharpened with suspicion, reminding me in every conversation that the charges were in my name and therefore my responsibility unless I could provide undeniable proof. Each time the representative read out the words legal consequences or court action, my body stiffened as if cold water had been poured down my spine, because I understood that even though I was the victim, in their eyes, I was already the criminal. They didn't hear the panic in my voice. They didn't feel my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. They only heard another account holder making excuses. And with every call I hung up from, I felt smaller, my throat raw from swallowing words that no one believed. The envelopes that arrived daily stamped with words like urgent, final warning, immediate action required, stared back at me like threats, and the shame of it all pressed down so heavily that even opening the mailbox became an act of dread. While I was drowning in paperwork and fear, she blossomed like a queen in springtime, stepping out into the world adorned with the spoils of my suffering, her diamonds flashing under the sunlight, her designer bags swinging from her arm, her perfume leaving a trail behind her like smoke from a fire she had set in my life. I watched her glide through Sunday service dressed in new clothes, her hands heavy with rings that caught the attention of everyone she greeted, while my own fingers curled into fists in my lap, the anger so sharp it left me dizzy. She laughed loudly, she smiled sweetly, she bragged in subtle ways that only women who crave power know how to do, and all the while I sat frozen, screaming silently inside, knowing that the champagne glow on her skin was bought with the hours of labor I had poured into my job, the sleepless nights I had endured, the careful budgeting that was meant to build a future for me and my husband. Her cruelty wasn't just in the theft, it was in the display, the taunting way she paraded her stolen life in front of me, daring me to expose her, daring me to risk the humiliation of being dismissed again. Every time our eyes met across a room, I saw the smirk that said she knew she was untouchable, and the fury that burned inside me had nowhere to go but inward, scorching my spirit. At home, the betrayal cut even deeper, because the one person I thought would stand by me chose silence and denial instead. When I showed him the growing mountain of bills, when I begged him to see what was happening, he sighed heavily, his voice dripping with impatience as he told me I was overreacting, that I must have spent more than I remembered, that stress was making me irrational. Each word was a knife twisting in my chest, because what he was really saying was that he believed her innocence over my truth, and that realization left me lonelier than I had ever been in my life. Loneliness in marriage is a crueler prison than solitude, because you are not just alone, you are unseen, and every night I lay beside him in bed, I felt the emptiness stretch wider, like an ocean between us. His indifference became another theft, one that hurt more than any stolen necklace or dress, because it robbed me of safety, of partnership, of the comfort I thought love was supposed to bring. I felt like a ghost in my own home, my words evaporating the moment they left my lips, leaving behind nothing but silence. The fear of collapse became my constant companion, haunting me in every room I walked through. I would touch the edge of the dining table we had bought together and wonder if soon it would be repossessed. Imagine the knock on the door from collectors who would strip my home bare. Picture neighbors whispering that I had destroyed myself with reckless spending, when in truth I had been destroyed by the woman they admired for her elegance. I thought of my parents discovering the truth, the disappointment in their eyes, the shame I would feel trying to explain how I had allowed myself to be bled dry by someone who called herself family. Each night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my body tense with dread, replaying every decision I had made, every time I had chosen silence instead of confrontation, and I wondered if this was my punishment for being too kind, too patient, too willing to sacrifice myself for the illusion of peace. There were moments when I nearly believed she had won completely, that my life would always belong to her shadow, But somewhere deep beneath the despair, a single thought kept whispering to me, "Arrogance leaves cracks, and cracks can be pried open." And one day I would find the proof that turned her stolen smile into ashes. It happened almost by accident, one of those small moments that doesn't look important until you realize it changes everything. I was cleaning the kitchen, trying to make order out of the chaos that had become my life, when I found a crumpled receipt stuffed carelessly in the trash, the ink slightly smudged but the numbers still clear. My first instinct was to throw it away, but something in me hesitated, and when I smoothed it out, my heart thudded against my ribs because there it was. Her handwriting, looping and arrogant, sprawled across the signature line of a purchase worth more than a month of my rent. I held the paper in my trembling hands, my eyes running over the familiar curves of her letters, the same shapes that had once scrawled holiday cards and shopping lists left casually on my counter. She had left her mark without realizing it, proof written in black ink that tied her directly to the mountain of debt crushing me. And as I stared at it, the first spark of something I had not felt in months began to flicker inside me. That night I couldn't sleep, the receipt tucked under my pillow like a secret weapon, and my mind kept spinning with the possibilities. What if this was the crack I had been waiting for? The weakness in her armor that could finally make the world see what she had done. I replayed every conversation with the bank, every sigh from my husband, every smirk from her painted lips, and for the first time I felt a shift. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't careless. I was right. The evidence in my hand whispered it over and over again until I believed it. And as the hours stretched into dawn, I began to wonder how far I could push this. What if I gathered more? What if I built a pile of proof so heavy no one could ignore it? What if I turned her arrogance into the rope that would finally choke her lies? The next day, I went further than I ever had before. My hands shook as I dialed the number printed on one of the statements, asking to speak to a manager at one of the boutiques where she had splurged. I explained that I needed information about a transaction, bracing for refusal, but to my shock, the manager was polite, even helpful, confirming the date and time and hinting that they still had in-store footage for that purchase. When he offered to print something for my records, I nearly dropped the phone, because in that moment I realized I could turn this nightmare into a case, not just a plea for sympathy, but a fortress of evidence no one could dismiss. When I hung up, I pressed the phone to my chest and closed my eyes, tears slipping down my face, but these weren't the tears of despair I had grown used to. These were tears of relief, of vindication, of the first breath of hope in a suffocating storm. Still, I knew I couldn't act too quickly, because hope without patience is just noise, and I needed silence to turn this into strategy. So I began to gather, quietly and carefully, collecting bank statements, highlighting signatures, tucking away receipts whenever I found them, and each piece of paper felt like a brick laid in the foundation of a wall that would one day trap her instead of me. For weeks I played the role she expected, smiling faintly, nodding when she bragged about her new jewelry, pretending to be too timid to fight back, while inside I held a growing arsenal she had no idea existed. Every night, I spread the evidence across my table, watching the pile grow until it looked less like scattered papers and more like a weapon forged from her own greed. For the first time in a long time, I felt power returning to my veins, a quiet power that didn't need to shout or beg to be heard. She had built her empire on my silence, but now my silence had become the mask that hid her undoing. The irony was that he grew bolder the quieter I became, mistaking my calm for defeat, using every gathering, every conversation, every dinner with his colleagues as an excuse to sharpen his cruelty in public. I let him, because each laugh at my expense, each careless insult, each heavy sigh of his supposed burden, only meant that when the truth finally came out, his fall would be sharper, his shame deeper, because he had made an entire theater out of mocking me. I thought often about how none of the people laughing with him would ever suspect that the woman sitting silently beside him was quietly outgrowing him, quietly building a life that would one day leave him exposed, and the thought became a source of strength, a reminder that revenge does not always roar. Sometimes it waits quietly until the timing is perfect. And so I built in silence, a rhythm of hidden strength that no one could see but me, carrying my secret like a flame cupped in my hands, fragile but steady, protected from the winds of his cruelty until it was strong enough to burn on its own. My days were filled with patience, my nights with progress, and every moment in between became a rehearsal for the day when the balance would shift. He thought he was in control. He thought I was his shadow, his burden, his leech. But in truth, he was blind to the storm I was becoming, blind to the future that no longer had him at the center. And each morning, as I slipped back into bed beside him and closed my tired eyes, I smiled faintly, because I knew what he did not, that the silence he mocked was the very thing that would undo him, and the woman he believed was powerless was quietly, methodically, preparing to stand taller than he could ever imagine. The first real signs of change arrived quietly, almost like gentle knocks on a door I had long believed was sealed shut. But when they came, they shook me to my core, because they proved I was no longer just surviving in silence. I was building something real. One morning, while he grumbled over bills at the table, sighing heavily as if the world weighed only on his shoulders, I checked my account in secret and saw a transfer that was larger than anything I had earned before. It wasn't fortune, but it was enough to cover the very bill he waved angrily in the air, enough to prove that the hours I had stolen back from my despair were now giving me strength. My chest tightened, my pulse raced, and I bit my lip to keep from smiling because I wanted to hold that victory close, to savor it quietly before it grew into something bigger. Soon after came the messages, real people, strangers across the country, praising my work, thanking me for what I offered, telling me that they would recommend me to others. Each note was like balm poured into the wounds he had carved into me, each kind word layering over the scars of his insults, until I felt myself standing taller, even if no one else could see it. At night I reread them in the glow of my screen, my eyes burning not from exhaustion but from gratitude, because finally someone saw me for more than the shadow he painted. Finally my value was reflected back in ways he could never erase. I whispered their words to myself like prayers, letting them replace the echo of his cruel laughter, and slowly the narrative he had forced onto me began to lose its grip. Yet I remained cautious, because the transformation was still in its infancy, fragile enough that if he suspected it, he might find a way to destroy it. So I let him keep his illusions. When he mocked me, I smiled softly. When he sighed about being the only one who worked, I lowered my eyes. When his friends laughed at his stories about my supposed helplessness, I laughed along, letting them all believe that I was still the woman they thought they knew. Inside, however, I carried a secret so precious it made me feel untouchable, because every dollar I earned, every client who returned, every task I completed without his knowledge was proof that I was building a new version of myself, a version that could one day walk away without fear. The patience I practiced was not weakness, it was strategy, and I savored the irony that his arrogance blinded him to the truth sitting right beside him. As the weeks turned into months, the change became steady enough that I could no longer deny it. My life was shifting, the scales beginning to tilt. I was no longer the woman who cried quietly in the bathroom after his insults. I was the woman who nodded calmly while her mind whispered, "You are stronger than he knows." The signs of change weren't loud enough for him to notice yet, but they were loud enough for me, and they gave me a confidence that no amount of his cruelty could touch. I began to carry myself differently, my shoulders a little straighter, my eyes steadier when I looked in the mirror, and though I still played the role of the leech he wanted to believe I was, inside me a new identity had taken root, one that would eventually burst into the open and leave him stunned, because the woman he mocked was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned the power of patience, silence, and relentless determination. The breaking point came on a night that was supposed to be nothing more than another polite dinner, a chance for him to parade me in front of his colleagues. but it turned into the moment where I knew without a doubt that silence could not last forever. We sat in a glossy restaurant filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, and I tried to focus on my plate, telling myself to endure just a few hours more when I heard his voice cut through the chatter, louder than it needed to be, carrying that same smug tone he had used so many times before. He told a story about me, a cruel invention wrapped in humor, painting me as incapable of even handling small tasks, describing me as a woman who needed constant rescuing, a burden he carried out of pity. The table erupted in laughter, forks paused in midair, glasses lifted in mock toasts, and I felt every eye land on me as though I were a spectacle to be consumed. I smiled faintly, because that was the role I had learned to play, but inside my chest something snapped with such force I could almost hear it. The humiliation was sharper than my birthday, because it came not from a single insult, but from an entire performance crafted to reduce me in the eyes of people who barely knew me, colleagues who would carry that version of me in their minds long after the dinner ended. I watched as they chuckled, some awkwardly, some with genuine amusement, and I realized with a kind of cold clarity that he had not only stolen my dignity, he had traded it for his entertainment. In that moment, I was no longer simply enduring cruelty. I was cataloging it, memorizing every smirk and every laugh, because I knew that one day each of them would remember this night very differently. The irony was that as he grew bolder, he became blind. He didn't notice the way my eyes no longer dropped in shame, but narrowed in calculation. He didn't notice that my smile no longer trembled, but steadied into something controlled. He believed completely in the fiction he had created, convinced that I would always sit quietly while he mocked me, convinced that his audience would never see past the curtain he pulled. And while he basked in their laughter, raising his glass as though he had delivered some brilliant performance, I sat still, my mind steady, my heartbeat calm, and for the first time I felt not just hurt, but powerful, because I understood that the more he built his pride on these stories, the harder the crash would be when the truth came out. By the time dessert arrived, the damage was done. He had humiliated me more deeply than ever before, and I could see in the glances around the table that some of his colleagues no longer even questioned whether the stories were true. They simply accepted them, smiling at me with pity or disdain. That night, as I excused myself from the table and walked slowly to the restroom, I stared into the mirror and saw a woman who no longer resembled the one who had once cried silently after his words. My reflection looked back with steadiness, with fire hidden just beneath the surface, and I whispered to myself that this would be the last time. The boiling point had been reached, and though no one else could hear it, I knew that a storm was coming. The next time he chose to laugh at my expense, the stage he built for himself would collapse, and he would stand in the rubble of his own arrogance while I finally rose. The moment of truth came sooner than even I expected, but by then I was ready, carrying months of quiet work like armor under my skin, waiting for the instant when silence would no longer serve me, but the truth would. It happened at another gathering, one of those dinners he adored where he could hold court among his friends and colleagues, showing off his charm, painting me once again as his burden for their entertainment. I sat at the table listening as he laughed loudly, retelling the same tired stories about my supposed helplessness, exaggerating details until they sounded like scenes from a comedy, and I watched the faces around me split into grins and laughter while my heart beat calmly, not with shame this time, but with anticipation. When he raised his glass, smirking at me as though daring me to deny him, I knew the moment had come. I placed my napkin gently on the table and reached for my bag, my movements steady and unhurried, while his voice carried on, oblivious to the shift that was about to unfold. I pulled out my tablet, unlocked it, and slid it across the table with a calmness that silenced even the laughter. On the screen was my business, my contracts, my numbers, the clients who had trusted me, the invoices paid, the revenue earned, every piece of evidence that the woman he had mocked as a leech had been quietly building something far stronger than his arrogance. Conversations stopped. Forks froze midair. I looked directly into his eyes, and though I didn't speak loudly, My words cut deeper than any insult he had ever thrown, telling him softly that this was what I had been doing while he laughed. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time, it was he who looked small. He whose face flushed with the realization that the image he had crafted was crumbling in front of everyone. The beauty of that moment was not only in his shock, but in the reactions around the table. His colleagues leaned closer, their eyes wide, scanning the proof that contradicted everything he had ever said about me. Some looked at me with new respect, others with disbelief, and a few with shame for having laughed along so easily. The room felt charged, as though the air itself had turned electric, and he sat there stammering, searching for words that would not come. He had built his pride on mocking me, but now every cruel word echoed back against him, exposing him not as the provider he claimed to be, but as the fraud who had hidden his debts while ridiculing the woman who had secretly become stronger than him. The contrast was almost poetic, and I savored it quietly, knowing that the silence now belonged to me. As the evening unraveled, I remained composed, eating calmly while he shifted uncomfortably beside me, his usual arrogance stripped away like a mask torn off too soon. He tried to laugh, to explain, to twist the story into something harmless, but no one was laughing with him now. They had seen too much. They had seen me. And as the meal ended and people filed out with sidelong glances, murmuring to one another, I understood that his carefully built image had been destroyed in one night, undone not by shouting or anger, but by the quiet strength he had underestimated all along. I walked out of that restaurant taller than I had ever felt in my life, my head high, my heart steady, because the big reveal had come, and it was more powerful than I could have imagined. He was no longer the man in control. He was the man exposed, and nothing he could say would ever erase what everyone had just witnessed. In the days that followed the dinner, the transformation was impossible to ignore, because the balance of power that had once tilted so heavily in his favor was gone, and I could feel it in every interaction, every silence, every look cast my way. His colleagues, who had once laughed without hesitation at his jokes about me, no longer found them amusing, and I could see it in the stiffness of their forced smiles, in the awkward pauses when he tried to resurrect old stories, in the way their attention shifted toward me rather than him. The man who had built his entire identity on controlling the narrative now found himself unable to command a room, while I, the woman he had called weak, began to sense a quiet respect surrounding me, the kind of respect he had always insisted I would never earn. It was subtle at first, but I could feel it growing, and it gave me a calmness he could not shake. At home, the reversal became undeniable. He stormed through the house, raising his voice in frustration, claiming that I had humiliated him, that I had turned everyone against him, that I had betrayed him by revealing my strength in front of others, yet his words fell flat because they no longer had the power to pierce me. I listened in silence, no longer shrinking, no longer trembling, because inside I carried the knowledge that I was no longer dependent on his approval or his version of reality. He shouted, but his shouts only revealed his desperation, the hollow echoes of a man whose control had slipped through his fingers. I thought of the nights I had spent hunched over my laptop, the tears I had swallowed, the insults I had endured, and now, watching him pace with rage, I realized the balance had shifted completely. I was no longer the one who was small. He was. The irony of it all was that the collapse of his pride was not caused by a single event, but by the very foundation he had built it on. He had relied so heavily on mocking me, on convincing others of my weakness, that once the truth surfaced, there was nothing left to hold his image together. Friends stopped calling, colleagues withdrew, even his family, who had once nodded along with his complaints about me, now asked quiet questions he could not answer, questions about the debts, about the lies, about the business I had created without his knowledge. He was left exposed, a man stripped of his illusions, and I watched as his arrogance melted into something pitiful, his once confident shoulders slumping, his voice growing quieter as though even he was no longer convinced by his own excuses. He had called me a leech, but now it was clear who had been draining whom all along. For me, the reversal was not only a triumph, but a liberation. I no longer woke with heaviness pressing on my chest, no longer studied my reflection searching for the woman I had lost. I was here, fully present, standing taller than I had in years, carrying myself with a quiet strength that no one could deny. My business grew, my confidence expanded, and my life began to fill with possibilities that had once seemed unreachable. I felt joy again, not the brittle joy of pretending, but real joy that came from the knowledge that I had built something with my own hands. He, on the other hand, became a shadow of himself, a man who once thrived on others' laughter, but now could not even command their attention. The contrast was absolute, and it gave me a peace deeper than revenge, because I did not need to destroy him. He had destroyed himself, and all I had done was rise when he expected me to stay down. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever known, because for the first time in years, I woke each morning without the heaviness of dread, without rehearsing ways to keep the peace, without bracing myself for words that would cut. The house that had once been filled with his arrogance now stood strangely still, but instead of suffocating, that silence felt liberating, a clean slate waiting to be filled with something new. He moved through it like a restless ghost, pacing and muttering, his voice losing strength with every day that passed, because the power he once held over me had slipped away, and there was nothing he could do to regain it. His calls went unanswered, his invitations ignored, his jokes fell flat, and the same people who had once cheered his performances now turned their backs. It was a quiet unraveling, not dramatic, not loud, but steady, relentless, and complete. And I knew in my heart that justice was unfolding not because I sought it, but because truth always has a way of rising. Meanwhile, my own life expanded in directions I had never dared to imagine during those nights of secrecy and exhaustion. The small business I had nurtured in silence grew into something steady, reliable, and empowering, and with each new client and each word of praise, I felt another piece of my old self returning, stronger and wiser than before. I no longer walked into rooms wondering how I would be perceived, no longer measured my worth by his moods, because I had learned that the only approval that mattered was my own. Friends who once looked at me with pity now spoke of me with admiration, and even strangers reached out to share how my work touched them, how my persistence inspired them. I began to laugh again, not the brittle laugh I had worn as armor, but laughter that rose from the deepest part of me, because I knew I had climbed out of a cage that was never built to hold me forever. He, on the other hand, did not fall quietly. At first he tried to fight, throwing accusations at me, insisting that I had humiliated him, trying to twist my strength into betrayal. But the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed, because his words no longer had claws. Then came the apologies, hollow at first, then desperate, as he realized that his audience was gone, and I was the only one left to hear him, but by then it was too late. Forgiveness cannot be begged into existence once respect has died, and no amount of pleading can erase the memory of humiliation endured. He had built his world on the illusion of being the provider, the strong one, the center, and now the illusion was gone. He sat at the table where he had once tossed bills with dramatic sighs, only this time it was my quiet strength paying them, and the irony hung heavy in the air. He had become the burden, and I was the one carrying myself without him. And so the story closed, with balance restored, in a way no one could deny. He lost the reputation he worshipped, the attention he thrived on, the pride he thought indestructible, and in their place he was left with emptiness, a man defined not by strength, but by arrogance stripped bare. I, however, gained the very things he had tried to crush in me: dignity, independence, peace, and the sweet knowledge that I had risen in spite of him. My life became a reflection of patience rewarded, of silence transformed into power, of pain turned into purpose. The moral is clear: never mock the one who sacrifices for you, never humiliate the one who loves you, because life always has a way of returning cruelty to the cruel. The silence you think is weakness may be the very silence that prepares the storm, and the person you call a leech may one day be the one who walks away free while you remain behind, alone with your own collapse. Justice did not roar when it arrived. It spoke softly, and in the end, its voice was louder than all his laughter put together. And if this story touched you, if it made you angry at the cruelty, relieved at the justice, or simply proud to see strength rise out of humiliation, then don't just leave quietly. Stay with me here. Hit that like button, leave a comment sharing how you felt, or even a story of your own, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Your support means more than you know. It tells me these stories matter, that voices like mine deserve to be heard, and that together we can keep proving that no cruelty ever wins in the end.